In the heart of the Bible lies a people who once shared the same lands as Israel, the Moabites. Known as the descendants of Moab, the Moabites played a significant yet complex role in the biblical narrative. Who were they, and what influence did they have on the ancient world? Today, we explore the history of the Moabites, tracing their origins and examining the key moments that brought them into the spotlight of biblical history. This is a story of ancient ties, rooted in family connections through Lot, Abraham's nephew. It is a tale of recurring conflicts, moments of cooperation, and a relationship filled with tension and intrigue. From their origins in the book of Genesis to their lasting impact on the unfolding events of Israel's history, the Moabites remain a fascinating part of the biblical account. The story of the Moabites begins with a figure from the Bible who is closely connected to the founding of Israel. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, plays a central role in the origins of this ancient people. To understand where the Moabites came from, we need to look back to a significant and dramatic event in the book of Genesis: the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities were infamous for their wickedness, and God decided to destroy them. However, Lot and his family were spared because of their connection to Abraham. After fleeing the destruction, Lot, along with his 2 daughters, took refuge in the mountains near the town of Zoar. The Bible tells us that they feared for their safety and believed that no one else was left alive in the surrounding area. Isolated and uncertain about the future, Lot's daughters faced a dilemma. In their minds, the human race might not survive if they didn't take action. So, in an act driven by desperation and a desire to preserve their family line, they made a troubling decision. The daughters took turns getting their father, Lot, drunk and then slept with him. Both daughters became pregnant through this act. The firstborn daughter gave birth to a son, whom she named Moab. He would become the father of the Moabite people. The younger daughter also had a son, named Ben-Ammi, and he would become the father of the Ammonites, another people group mentioned often in the Bible. This story, which is recorded in Genesis 19 verses 30 to 38, marks the beginning of 2 nations that would have a long and complex relationship with Israel. The origins of the Moabites and the Ammonites are significant for several reasons. First, the story itself highlights a recurring theme in the Bible: how nations are often born out of unique, sometimes difficult circumstances. In the case of Moab and Ben-Ammi, their origins were rooted in an act that many would find unsettling, yet it was this act that led to the formation of 2 important peoples in the ancient world. The cultural and historical implications of this story go beyond just the birth of a nation. It also gives us insight into the challenges of survival in the ancient Near East. The daughters of Lot likely felt isolated and vulnerable, unsure if they would ever encounter other people. This sense of urgency led them to take drastic steps to ensure the continuation of their family line. While their actions might seem extreme by today's standards, they reflect the harsh realities of life in that time period. Ensuring the survival of one's lineage was seen as essential, and family lines were often tied to a people's identity and inheritance. The fact that the Moabites were born from such unusual circumstances would shape their identity in the biblical narrative. Despite their shared ancestry with Israel through Lot, the Moabites were often viewed as outsiders or even enemies. They were not part of the covenant that God made with Abraham and his descendants, and this placed them in a different category, even though they were distant relatives of the Israelites. Geographically, the Moabites settled in a land that was to the east of Israel, on the other side of the Dead Sea. The land of Moab was a mountainous region with fertile plains, well suited for agriculture. This location gave the Moabites access to vital trade routes and resources, allowing them to establish a stable and prosperous society. Over time, they would grow into a significant regional power, often coming into contact with Israel, sometimes as allies but more often as adversaries. The origin story of the Moabites also provides a key biblical lesson about the consequences of decisions. Lot's daughters acted out of fear and a desire to preserve their family, but their actions also led to the creation of nations that would become enemies of Israel. This tension between kinship and conflict is a theme that runs throughout the Bible, especially when it comes to Israel's relationship with the Moabites and the Ammonites. Though they were related by blood, they often found themselves at odds with each other, competing for land, resources, and influence in the region. In addition to their challenging beginnings, the Moabites would come to be defined by their worship of a different god, Chemosh. While the Israelites worshipped Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Moabites worshipped Chemosh, a deity who would play a central role in their religious and cultural life. This religious divide further deepened the gap between the Moabites and the Israelites, even though they were originally connected through Lot. From a historical perspective, the story of Moab's birth serves as a reminder of the complexities of the ancient world. The peoples of the ancient Near East often had shared ancestry, yet their political and religious differences created deep divisions. In the case of Moab, their origin through Lot ties them to Israel in a way that makes their later interactions, both hostile and cooperative, even more significant. This origin story also reflects the biblical view that God's plans often involve unexpected people and situations. Though the Moabites were born out of a difficult situation, they would go on to play an important role in the biblical narrative. At times, they would challenge Israel's security and well-being, but as we will see later in our journey, they also become part of the story of redemption through key figures such as Ruth, a Moabite woman who became part of the lineage of King David and, ultimately, of Jesus Christ. So, the origins of the Moabites tell us much about the ancient world, a world of survival, kinship, and conflict. The story of Lot and his daughters, while difficult, laid the foundation for the rise of the Moabites, a people whose history and interactions with Israel are woven throughout the Bible. Understanding their beginnings helps us better grasp the significance of their later role in the biblical story, as both a people closely connected to Israel and as a nation that stood apart, often in opposition. The Moabites were shaped by their origins, and their interactions with Israel would continue to reflect the complex dynamics that began with Lot's daughters in the mountains after the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Moabites made their home in a region located east of the Dead Sea, in what is now part of modern-day Jordan. This territory, known as Moab, stretched from the Arnon River in the north to the Zered River in the south. It was a relatively small area, but it played an important role in the history of the ancient Near East due to its location and natural features. Let's begin by looking at the geography of Moab. The Arnon River, which runs from east to west, served as the northern boundary of Moab. This river was not only a natural border, but it also provided a crucial source of water for the region, making the surrounding land fertile and suitable for farming. The river cut through the steep mountains of the area, creating deep canyons and valleys that provided natural protection for the Moabites. The rugged terrain around the Arnon made it difficult for invading armies to easily pass through, giving the Moabites a strategic advantage when it came to defending their land. South of the Arnon River, the land of Moab consisted of rolling hills and plains. These plains were fertile, ideal for growing crops and grazing livestock. This agricultural abundance allowed the Moabites to build a stable economy based on farming and trade. The fertile land made Moab self-sufficient in terms of food production, which was a key factor in the growth of the kingdom. To the east, the land rose into a high plateau, which was part of a larger mountain range that extended across the region. This elevated land was not only useful for agriculture, but it also provided a natural defense barrier. From these highlands, the Moabites could observe movement in the surrounding areas, giving them an advantage in both trade and warfare. One of the most important features of Moab was its location. Positioned at the crossroads of major trade routes, the land of Moab was perfectly situated for trade with other nations. Caravans passing through the area brought goods from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Moab's proximity to these routes allowed it to control valuable trade networks, bringing wealth and influence to the kingdom. It was a strategic hub for merchants traveling between the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. In addition to its geographic advantages, Moab was bordered by several important regions. To the west, across the Dead Sea, lay the land of Israel. To the north was the territory of the Amorites, and to the south, the land of Edom. These neighboring nations often interacted with Moab, sometimes through trade and at other times through conflict. Moab's position between these larger nations meant that it frequently found itself involved in the political and military struggles of the region. The Dead Sea, located on Moab's western edge, also played a significant role in the life of the Moabites. While its waters were not suitable for drinking or agriculture, the Dead Sea served as a natural barrier that separated Moab from Israel. This massive saltwater lake, one of the saltiest bodies of water on earth, was a unique feature of the region and added to the isolation of the Moabites from their western neighbors. Despite its relatively small size, the land of Moab was rich in resources and strategically important. The fertile plains provided food for its people, the rivers and mountains gave natural protection, and the trade routes brought wealth and connections with distant lands. The strategic value of Moab's location meant that it was often a target for surrounding nations, and its people were frequently involved in regional conflicts, particularly with Israel. The Bible frequently mentions the Arnon River as the border between Moab and its neighbors. This natural boundary was not only important for marking territory, but it also symbolized the division between Moab and the Israelites. Even though the Moabites were related to the Israelites through their ancestor Lot, the Arnon River stood as a dividing line between the two nations. It was a place of both separation and conflict, as the Israelites and Moabites often found themselves on opposite sides of this river in times of war. The southern boundary of Moab was marked by the Zerd River. Like the Arnon, the Zerd served as a natural marker for the end of Moabite territory. Beyond the Zerd lay the land of Edom, another neighboring nation that had a complex relationship with Moab. The rivers that formed Moab's borders not only defined its physical territory but also played a role in shaping its identity as a nation. While Moab's borders were defined by rivers, the heart of the land was its fertile plains. These plains were vital to Moab's survival and success. The Moabites were skilled farmers, and their agricultural wealth allowed them to sustain a growing population and maintain independence for much of their history. The Bible describes Moab as a land of vineyards, and the Moabites were known for their production of wine. This agricultural prosperity made Moab an attractive target for surrounding nations, but it also gave the Moabites the resources they needed to defend themselves and maintain their independence. In addition to its agricultural wealth, Moab was rich in natural resources. The mountains and hills of the region were home to mineral deposits, and the Moabites likely engaged in mining and other forms of resource extraction. These resources, combined with the wealth generated by trade, made Moab a powerful kingdom in the ancient world. Despite its advantages, the land of Moab was not without its challenges. The region was prone to droughts, and the Moabites, like many other peoples in the ancient Near East, were heavily dependent on rainfall for their crops. In times of drought, the Moabites would have struggled to sustain their population, and this may have contributed to periods of instability and conflict in their history. The mountainous terrain, while providing protection, also made it difficult to expand their territory or easily communicate with distant parts of their kingdom. Nevertheless, the land of Moab, with its fertile plains, protective mountains, and strategic location, played a central role in the development of the Moabite kingdom. It was this land that allowed the Moabites to grow into a powerful and independent nation, even as they faced challenges from their neighbors. In the ancient world, geography often determined the fate of nations, and Moab's location was no exception. The combination of fertile land, natural defenses, and access to trade routes helped the Moabites maintain their place in the biblical narrative for centuries. Understanding the land of Moab is key to understanding the people themselves, how they lived, how they thrived, and how they interacted with the world around them. The relationship between the Moabites and the Israelites was complex and filled with tension. Although they were connected by blood, as the Moabites were descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham, their shared ancestry did little to guarantee lasting peace. The history between these two nations was marked by cycles of conflict, brief periods of cooperation, and events that would forever shape their reputations in the biblical narrative. Let's begin with one of the most memorable encounters between the two nations, King Balak and the prophet Balaam, an episode recorded in Numbers 22-24. During the time when the Israelites were journeying to the Promised Land, they approached the borders of Moab. Fearing that the Israelites would invade and destroy his kingdom, Balak, the king of Moab, decided to take drastic action. Instead of engaging in direct warfare, Balak sought to curse the Israelites by hiring Balaam, a well-known prophet from the region, to cast a curse on them. Balak's plan was simple. If the Israelites were cursed by Balaam, their strength would fail, and they could be defeated. Balaam, however, was a prophet who communicated with God. Despite Balak's promises of great wealth and reward, Balaam made it clear that he could only say what God allowed him to say. Balak insisted, and after several attempts to curse the Israelites, Balaam instead pronounced blessings over them. Each time he tried to speak a curse, God directed him to speak blessings instead. This incident highlights the deep-seated fear that Moab had toward Israel. Balak recognized the power of Israel's God, yet he hoped to manipulate that power for his own gain. The story also demonstrates that even though Moab and Israel were often at odds, God's protection over Israel remained steadfast. The inability of Balaam to curse Israel was a clear sign of God's favor, and it sent a message to the surrounding nations, including Moab, that Israel's destiny was guided by divine hands. Next, we turn to another significant moment in Moabite-Israelite relations, the story of King Eglon of Moab, recorded in Judges chapter 3. During this period, Israel was still in the early stages of settling in the Promised Land. After a time of disobedience to God, the Israelites found themselves oppressed by neighboring nations, including the Moabites. King Eglon of Moab formed an alliance with the Ammonites and Amalekites and led an invasion against Israel. Eglon captured the city of Jericho, often called the City of Palms, and for 18 years he ruled over Israel with an iron fist. Eglon's reign over Israel was a dark time for the Israelites, marked by heavy tribute and humiliation. But, as is often the case in the book of Judges, God raised up a deliverer. This time, it was a man named Ehud, a left-handed Benjamite. Ehud devised a plan to free Israel from Moabite oppression. Pretending to bring tribute to King Eglon, Ehud concealed a double-edged dagger on his right side, where it was less likely to be detected. After presenting the tribute, Ehud asked for a private audience with the king, claiming he had a secret message for him. Once alone with Eglon, Ehud drew his dagger and assassinated the king. The act of Ehud's bravery sparked a rebellion, and the Israelites were able to overthrow the Moabite rulers, regaining their freedom. This story highlights the ongoing conflict between the two nations. Though Moab was able to oppress Israel for a time, the Israelites believed that their deliverance was always in God's hands. The rise and fall of Moab's power over Israel during this period serves as a reminder that, in the biblical narrative, God's justice would eventually prevail. Another important event in the relationship between Moab and Israel occurred in Numbers 25. After their failed attempt to curse Israel through Balaam, the Moabites resorted to another tactic. Moabite women began to seduce Israelite men, leading them into idolatry and sexual immorality. The Israelite men were not only engaging in relationships with the Moabite women, but they were also being drawn into the worship of Baal, a Moabite deity. This mixing of religious practices was seen as a grave sin in the eyes of God. As a result of this disobedience, a plague struck the Israelite camp, killing 24,000 people. The incident revealed the danger of Israel compromising its identity and faith by adopting the practices of other nations. God's anger was severe because the Israelites had violated their covenant relationship with him by turning to other gods. This event significantly damaged the reputation of the Moabites in Israelite history. They were no longer seen merely as a foreign people or distant relatives, but as a nation that had led Israel into sin and caused divine punishment to fall on the chosen people. These three key moments, Balak's attempt to curse Israel, King Eglon's oppression, and the seduction of Israelite men by Moabite women, shaped the way the Israelites viewed Moab. Over time, Moab became a symbol of a nation that was both a physical and spiritual threat to Israel. Their frequent clashes, whether in battle or through cultural and religious conflict, reinforced the idea that the Moabites were not to be trusted. The tension between the two nations was not simply about land or power, but it was also about maintaining the purity of Israel's relationship with God. Yet, despite these conflicts, the relationship between Moab and Israel was not entirely one of enmity. There were times when the two nations cooperated, particularly when they shared common interests or enemies. Additionally, the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman who became the great-grandmother of King David, shows that there were moments of redemption and connection between the two peoples. But for much of their shared history, the Moabites were seen as adversaries. ones who opposed Israel's progress and, at times, led them into temptation. The history of the relationship between Moab and Israel serves as a reminder of the complexities of human relationships. Even though they were distant relatives, their interactions were marked by conflict, fear, and betrayal. Moab's attempts to undermine Israel, whether through spiritual deception or military oppression, highlight the ongoing struggle for power and influence in the region. But more importantly, these stories emphasize Israel's dependence on God for protection and guidance. No matter how strong Moab's efforts were to harm or curse Israel, the biblical narrative shows that Israel's fate was ultimately determined by God, not by the schemes of their enemies. The Moabites, like many ancient peoples, had a national God whom they worshipped and looked to for guidance in all aspects of life. For the Moabites, that God was Chemosh. Throughout the Bible, Chemosh is referred to as the primary deity of the Moabite people, and his worship was deeply intertwined with their culture, politics, and identity. Chemosh was not just a god of everyday life, but a god specifically associated with war and sacrifice. The Moabites believed that Chemosh had the power to bring them victory in battle, protect their land, and secure their future. As we've seen, Moab was often involved in conflict with its neighbors, and during times of war, Chemosh was invoked for strength and protection. In the biblical narrative, the Moabites viewed their successes and failures in battle as a reflection of Chemosh's favor or displeasure. Let's look at some key references in the Bible that help us understand the significance of Chemosh in Moabite life. In Judges 11 verse 24, we encounter a moment where the Ammonite king, in a dispute with Jephthah, an Israelite leader, argues that just as Israel claims land given to them by their God, Yahweh, the Moabites claim land that Chemosh gave to them. This reference highlights how Chemosh was seen as a territorial god, responsible for granting land and authority to the Moabites. It also shows that Chemosh was considered on par with other gods of the region in terms of power and influence. Another significant reference is found in 1 Kings 11 verse 7, where Chemosh is mentioned in connection to the worship practices introduced by King Solomon late in his reign. In this passage, Solomon, influenced by his foreign wives, builds high places for foreign gods, including Chemosh, on the hills near Jerusalem. This act of allowing the worship of Chemosh and other foreign deities within Israel was viewed as a great sin in the eyes of the biblical writers, one that ultimately led to Solomon's downfall. The mention of Chemosh here shows that his influence extended beyond Moab and into neighboring lands, even infiltrating Israel at times. Worship of Chemosh involved sacrifices, some of which may have been human. In 2 Kings 3, we see a dramatic example of this during a battle between Israel and Moab. The Moabite king, in desperation during the siege, offers his own son as a burnt offering on the city wall to appease Chemosh. The sacrifice is followed by a great wrath that leads the Israelites to withdraw from the battle. This act of human sacrifice underscores the intensity of the Moabites' devotion to Chemosh, as well as their belief that such extreme offerings could change the course of events in their favor. Chemosh's role in Moabite identity cannot be understated. He was more than just a god of religion. He was the protector of their land, the giver of victories, and the one who determined their destiny. The Moabites believed that their nation's successes were dependent on Chemosh's will, and when they faced defeat, they saw it as a sign of Chemosh's anger or abandonment. This belief system shaped how they engaged in warfare, diplomacy, and their overall worldview. The Bible portrays Chemosh as a false god, in opposition to Yahweh, the God of Israel. However, for the Moabites, Chemosh was central to their sense of nationhood and survival. His worship was an integral part of their daily lives, and the Moabites constructed altars, shrines, and temples dedicated to him. These religious sites were places where the Moabites gathered to offer sacrifices, animal and sometimes human, and to seek Chemosh's favor in times of peace and war. The worship of Chemosh, particularly in times of conflict, highlights the religious and cultural differences between Moab and Israel. While Israel was commanded to serve only Yahweh, the Moabites remained devoted to Chemosh throughout their history. This devotion was both a source of strength for Moab and a point of division between them and the Israelites. Despite the history of conflict and tension between Israel and Moab, There is a beautiful story of redemption found in the Bible that offers a different perspective on the Moabites. This story centers around a remarkable woman named Ruth, whose journey showcases love, loyalty, and faith in the face of adversity. The book of Ruth opens during a time of famine in Israel, prompting a man named Elimelech, along with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, to leave Bethlehem and settle in the land of Moab. Unfortunately, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Her sons marry Moabite women, one of whom is Ruth. Tragically, after about 10 years, both sons also die, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, without husbands. Faced with this devastating loss, Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, believing that life may be better for her in her homeland. She urges her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab and find new husbands. Orpah ultimately chooses to stay, but Ruth is determined to accompany Naomi. In a poignant declaration of loyalty, Ruth tells Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God my God." This powerful statement demonstrates Ruth's deep commitment to Naomi and her willingness to embrace a new life in Israel. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi face challenges, but Ruth's determination shines through. To support them, Ruth goes to glean in the fields, following behind the harvesters to collect leftover grain. It is here that she meets Boaz, a wealthy relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz notices Ruth's hard work and kindness toward Naomi, and he ensures that she is treated well in his fields. As the story unfolds, Ruth's loyalty and character attract Boaz, who recognizes her dedication not just to Naomi, but also to God. Boaz praises Ruth for her choice to stay with Naomi and for leaving her own people to join a foreign land. He becomes her protector, ensuring she has enough food and safety while she works. Eventually, Naomi devises a plan to secure Ruth's future. She instructs Ruth to approach Boaz during the harvest celebration at night and to ask him to act as a kinsman redeemer. In Israelite culture, a kinsman redeemer was a close relative who had the duty to help family members in distress, particularly in matters of marriage and property. Ruth follows Naomi's advice, and Boaz is moved by her request. He agrees to take on the role of kinsman redeemer, but there is another relative who is closer in relation and has the first right to redeem. Boaz, acting with integrity, approaches the closer relative in the city gate, where legal matters were settled. He presents the opportunity for redemption, but when the relative learns that he would have to marry Ruth and raise a child in her deceased husband's name, he declines. Boaz then steps forward to marry Ruth, fulfilling the role of kinsman redeemer. Their marriage brings joy and redemption to both Ruth and Naomi. Ruth becomes a mother when she gives birth to a son named Obed. The women of the town praise Ruth, declaring, "He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." Obed becomes the grandfather of King David, placing Ruth directly in the lineage of one of Israel's greatest kings. This story of Ruth is remarkable not only for its themes of love and loyalty but also for the way it reshapes the view of the Moabites in biblical history. Despite being a foreigner and a descendant of Lot, Ruth is portrayed as a woman of virtue, faith, and courage. Her unwavering commitment to Naomi and her embrace of the God of Israel present a narrative of inclusion and grace that transcends ethnic and national boundaries. Moreover, Ruth's significance extends beyond her immediate story. As noted in the genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew 1 verse 5, Ruth is explicitly mentioned as an ancestor of Jesus. This connection to Jesus highlights a profound truth: God's plan of redemption encompasses all people, including those from nations previously viewed as enemies. Through Ruth, the Moabites are woven into the story of salvation, showing that faith and loyalty matter more than lineage. Ruth's legacy is a testament to the transformative power of faith and love. In her life, we see the breaking down of barriers, the rejection of prejudice, and the beautiful unfolding of God's redemptive plan. While the Moabites often faced hostility from the Israelites due to their history, Ruth's story serves as a reminder that individuals can rise above the narratives of their nations and become instruments of divine purpose. Like many other nations described in the Bible, Moab eventually faced its decline and destruction. Over the centuries, the Moabites struggled with pride, hostility, and resistance to Israel, which would ultimately lead to their downfall. Prophets such as Isaiah and Jeremiah spoke out against Moab, delivering powerful messages from God that foretold its fate. In the book of Isaiah, chapters 15 and 16 present a vivid portrayal of the impending judgment against Moab. Isaiah describes the devastation that will befall the cities of Moab, including Kir and Dibon. The imagery of mourning and destruction is palpable as Isaiah writes about the cries and lamentations that will echo through the land. The Moabites, who had relied on their own strength and pride, are warned that their confidence will lead to their ruin. Jeremiah also delivers a scathing prophecy against Moab in chapter 48. He speaks of Moab's arrogance and describes how the nation has trusted in its own accomplishments and military power. God, through Jeremiah, declares that Moab will be brought low, and its fortified cities will be destroyed. The vivid imagery of destruction continues as Jeremiah uses phrases like, "Moab is destroyed," and "the shout of the Moabites is silenced." The message is clear: Moab's pride will not protect it from divine judgment. As these prophecies unfolded, we see the decline of Moab in the historical record. The rise of powerful empires, such as the Babylonians and the Assyrians, further contributed to Moab's downfall. During the Babylonian conquest, Moab was subjected to invasions and oppression. The once proud nation that had stood in opposition to Israel became vulnerable to external forces. In the wake of these invasions, the cities of Moab fell, and its people were scattered. By the time we reach the later historical periods, we find that Moab was no longer a significant power in the region. The prophecies delivered by Isaiah and Jeremiah were not just warnings, they were foretellings of what would come to pass. As Moab was absorbed into larger empires, it lost its distinct identity and influence. The fulfillment of these prophecies serves as a reminder of the consequences of pride and rebellion against God. Moab's downfall illustrates the biblical theme that nations, like individuals, must recognize their dependence on God. The Moabites' refusal to turn from their idolatrous practices and their consistent opposition to Israel led to their ultimate demise. The once fertile and strategically significant land of Moab became desolate and empty. The ruins of ancient Moab still stand as a testament to this decline, echoing the warnings of the prophets. The once vibrant cities became a shadow of their former selves, overrun by nature and history, reflecting the judgment that had been proclaimed. Today, as we explore the remnants of Moab, we can see the fulfillment of these ancient prophecies. The stones of their cities bear silent witness to the pride that led to their fall. It serves as a powerful reminder that even nations that once stood tall can crumble when they turn away from the truth. In the broader context of biblical history, the decline of Moab also illustrates God's sovereignty over the nations. Throughout the scriptures, we see that God holds nations accountable for their actions. Moab's story is intertwined with the narratives of Israel, demonstrating that while nations may rise and fall, God's purposes will always prevail. The fall of Moab is a part of the larger story of redemption, showcasing the consequences of sin and the importance of humility before God. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the Moabites. We hope this exploration has provided insight into their complex legacy and the significant role they played in the biblical narrative. If you found this video insightful, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content on biblical history and ancient civilizations. Your support helps us continue sharing these fascinating stories. Until next time, may you find inspiration in the diverse and rich history that shapes our understanding of faith and humanity.